Human activity is affecting grizzly bears in the Bow Valley of Alberta. Urban development and landscape fragmentation is a major impediment to sustaining stable grizzly bear populations, and as such, population management is complicated. These concerns lend to the question, how are human disturbances affecting grizzly bear populations in the Bow Valley as indicators of ecological integrity? The entire Bow Valley watershed spans a large portion of southwestern and central Alberta. The region of interest in terms of this research project is in the Upper Bow Valley. The Upper Bow Valley contains the communities of Banff and Canmore, and the Trans-Canada Highway dissects the length of the Upper Valley, referred to as the Bow Valley Parkway. This valley is restricted on both sides by topography, capping development, but also restricting movement of wildlife along its narrow remaining corridors. This region of the valley is an important conduit for the movement of wildlife from Yellowstone National Park to the Yukon, and it helps to maintain genetic diversity in populations north of Canmore and south into Kananaskis. In 2012, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada deemed southern Alberta's grizzly bears as a species of concern. Grizzly bears are apex predatory creatures and require a large range to obtain food and display behaviors necessary for reproduction and survival. As such, they are particularly vulnerable to habitat changes and human disturbances. These sensitivities to changes in the ecosystem make them an excellent indicator of ecological integrity in their home ranges. The grizzly bear is also an umbrella species, meaning that managing for grizzly bear habitat provides habitat for many other species. Grizzly bears in the Bow Valley have been protected by a provincial recovery policy since being deemed a species of concern. One of the elements of the provincial recovery policy is the monitoring of grizzly bear populations and recording human-caused mortalities. Research has determined that the Bow Valley has a reduced capacity to maintain grizzly bears due to reduced habitat continuity. Populations could be unstable due to bears preferring habitats not imposed upon by humans, and the population in the Bow Valley is 5 times less than regions adjacent to west of Alberta. There are several factors that impede the habituation of grizzly bears in the valley. Fragmentation of habitats, human interactions, and corridor restrictions due to urban sprawl. Roads and railways are one of the major ways in which grizzly bear habitat is divided. Research by Proctor and colleagues found that most grizzly bears are killed near a road, and between 77 and 90% of grizzly mortalities are human-caused. Anthropogenically disturbed areas can actually increase the abundance of seasonal food availability due to the forest canopy being opened. This results in the growth of understory containing berry bushes. While increased food availability benefits grizzly, it also causes more human interactions in these areas, ultimately increasing grizzly mortalities. Ladle and co-authors found that grizzly bears avoided areas with motorized recreational use, decreasing their usable habitat. In addition to lessening the range of grizzly bears, motorized use reduced habitat effectiveness for grizzly bears and as such lowered reproductive rates, body condition, and ultimately population densities, as stated by Proctor and colleagues. Proctor and colleagues also found that fragmenting the range of movement for grizzly bears can result in lower survival rates of females as the road density increases, leading to less genetic variability within the region. Grizzly bears will change their range and select habitats less utilized by recreation. Hiking trails are considered less burdensome to grizzly bears than motorized use trails or roads, but they can increase the occurrence of human-bear conflicts, thus increasing the number of relocations and subsequent mortalities. This is concerning in light of research by Ladle and colleagues indicating that all classes of bears utilize trails for movements. Trail use monitoring highlights the recovery challenges based in concerns from people utilizing recreational hiking trails. Some recreationalists feel that more bears means more interactions, and there are challenges associated with changing these perspectives, and as such, human behavior in terms of habitat respect and following guidelines for reducing bear interactions. Ultimately, increased human-bear interactions result in increased removals and mortalities. Human-bear conflicts on the trails are a survival concern for grizzly bears due to reactive relocations and the subsequent higher rates of indirect human-related mortality. Changing human behaviors to lessen the risk of conflicting with bears on the trails remains a challenge in the Bow Valley. Coleman and colleagues studied grizzly bears in a research situation where movements were restricted and humans were present. Movements of the bears were not restricted and humans were present, and movements were not restricted and humans were not present. Bears were more than twice as likely to inhabit an area if humans weren't present and their movements weren't restricted. Overall, stress caused due to grizzly bears from human avoidance can influence the bear's fitness and therefore their overall survival rates. Town sites are a risk for human-bear conflicts. Town site risk mitigation involves a change in human and bear behavior. Much work has been done to reduce garbage as an attractant in the Bow Valley with the introduction of bear-proof bins, but town site mortality rates are still nearly as high as the mortality rates for all other human-bear interactions combined. Bears that are not receptive to aversive conditioning will end up translocated. If relocation is unsuccessful, the bear may end up as a human-caused mortality statistic. It's important for residents of the valley to remove attractants such as birdseed, fruit-bearing trees, and garbage, allowing bears to filter through and not linger. Contributing to the problems associated with human-bear interactions is the restriction of space for grizzly bears to move by town sites with ease. The corridor for animal movement in the Bow Valley is decreasing due to urban sprawl. The Bow Valley is an important wildlife corridor for the movement of wildlife from Yellowstone to the Yukon, but development in the towns of Banff and Canmore have encroached on the space available for animals to move through the valley. Topography has constrained the width of the corridor that is further narrowed by urban development. When animals are not able to move freely from region to region, there is evidence of genetic isolation occurring in populations, ultimately reducing survival rates of the entire population. Robust populations can be divided by development and reduce the integrity of both populations, making them more susceptible to human disturbances. So what does this all mean in terms of ecological integrity of the Bow Valley? Parks Canada states that an ecosystem has integrity when it is deemed characteristic for its natural region, including the composition and abundance of native species and biological communities, rates of change, and supporting processes. Gibbo and colleagues determined that a thriving grizzly bear population indicates that other elements of the terrestrial ecosystem are managed effectively. Grizzly bear populations in the Bow Valley are stressed and impacted by human activities, indicating that the ecosystems are not being managed to function effectively. 23 years ago, Banff National Park within the Bow Valley was indicated as an impaired ecosystem, and work has been underway to mitigate the effects of human activity. There are many strategies for coexisting with wildlife in the Bow Valley, all rooted in the desire for the ecosystem to flourish and wildlife to thrive, while allowing humans to enjoy the landscape within an accepted framework. Wildlife crossings are used to mitigate the fragmentation caused by highway construction and lessen wildlife mortalities as they move from range to range. Protected wildlife areas in regions surrounding towns, as well as in the backcountry, are an important refuge for wildlife. Changing human behaviors by educating recreational seekers about bears foraging in the area, and electric fencing is used for aversive training of bears entering zones in which bears cannot be allowed. The Coexisting with Wildlife document is compiled from a stakeholder group composed of Bow Valley biologists, ecologists, resource managers, MLAs, municipal representatives, and policymakers. The document is based on discussions, research, and decisions to employ best practices for managing the wildlife movement and population growth while ensuring public safety. WildSmart is an educational program for children and adults living in the Bow Valley following the tragic death of Isabelle Dubé by a grizzly bear mauling. The Bow Valley has the very first corridor plan in North America and continues to monitor the movement of wildlife through the valley. It's important to listen to and implement the knowledge of the Stoney Nakoda First Nations that reside in the Bow Valley as how to manage the land for the well-being of wildlife. The Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative protects core habitats, works to keep these habitats connected, and inspires others to engage in similar work. Educating communities about the bears living in the valley and their patterns is important. Identifying the bears and providing information to people regarding the bears endears them to the community. People work at maintaining a coexistence with animals that they are familiar with and will adopt behaviors to protect them. The boss, Bear 122, and Split Lip, Bear 136, are examples of elder bears well known to the community. Maintaining grizzly bear populations in the Bow Valley is dependent on disturbance management. Coexisting with grizzly bears to ensure thriving populations requires changes in human behavior, perspectives, and a responsibility to wildlife. Managing the current disturbances and reducing further disturbance are important factors in achieving ecosystem stability, thus sustaining grizzly bear body condition, reproductive success, and ultimately their presence in this fragmented landscape.